Imagine, imagine a government where the civil servants literally use their lunch breaks to protest on the street against the very foreign policy they're being paid to implement.
Right.
Like, for some people, that is just the ultimate expression of a healthy moral democracy.
Yeah, exactly. The sound of people refusing to check their conscience at the door.
But for others, I mean, it is absolute proof that the government has been hijacked from the inside, that the people we elected are just no longer actually in charge.
This is a terrifying thought for a lot of people.
It really is. And today, we are looking at a single, highly combustible interview that sort of accidentally diagnoses exactly why modern society feels like it's ripping apart at the seams. You are listening to our latest deep dive, and we're asking a massive question.
Yeah, the big one.
Right. In an era where everyone feels their voice is being actively ignored, is democracy itself fundamentally broken? Or is it just like the specific way we are practicing it right now?
It really is the defining question of our time, you know? And to explore it, we aren't going to look at abstract political theory.
Thank goodness.
Right, no textbooks today. We are looking at a very specific, very intense conversation where this exact dynamic just plays out in real time. It's an incredibly revealing stress test of how we talk to each other.
Or how we completely fail to talk to each other, honestly.
A little bit.
So today's deep dive is based on this fascinating hour-long video interview. It's produced by a Dutch organization called Meer Democratie, which translates to more democracy.
And they advocate for more direct citizen involvement in politics, right?
They do, yeah. And the setup for this interview is what makes it so compelling. The interviewer comes from a clearly, left-leaning progressive background. He's an institutionalist.
Someone who really believes in systems and data.
Exactly. But for the very first episode of their new series, he sits down with a man named Wierd Duk. Now, if you aren't plugged into the Dutch media landscape, Duk is a prominent, often highly controversial journalist and podcaster.
A former foreign correspondent, too.
Yeah, and in the Netherlands, he is frequently and sometimes aggressively labeled as a right-wing populist.
It's a collision of two completely different, almost mutually exclusive worldviews. You have this progressive institutionalist actively trying to understand a conservative populist.
Or at least someone who is, consistently categorized as one by the mainstream.
Right. And before we go any further, it is really crucial that we set some ground rules for our deep dive today.
Yeah.
The source material we are unpacking contains highly charged political viewpoints from completely across the political spectrum. It touches on, well, absolute flashpoints.
Migration, the war in Ukraine, climate change, the Middle East.
All the heavy hitters. And as your guides through this material, we are not taking sides. We are not endorsing the viewpoints of the progressive interviewer, nor are we endorsing the viewpoints of Wierd Duk.
Right, we're just mapping it out.
Our job is simply to impartially map out the arguments presented in the source material. We want to show you the architecture of this debate, the underlying mechanics, so you can just, understand the dynamics of our current political moment.
Okay, let's unpack this, because our mission today is to figure out how a society actually handles extreme polarization.
It's a huge task.
It is. We are going to look at the deeply emotional debate over migration, the total collapse of trust in institutions, and the desperate search for solutions. Specifically, this massive clash between using citizen assemblies versus legally binding referendums.
But to do that, we have to start by understanding how these two men view the world, and perhaps more importantly, how the media views them.
Right, the meta-narrative.
Before you can analyze the specific arguments being made, you really have to look at that meta-narrative. How are the people having the argument perceived by the culture at large?
Because the source material actually starts by playing a clip from a major Dutch newspaper, NRC, right?
Yeah, and the clip explicitly labels Wierd Duk as a pioneer of polarization.
A pioneer of polarization. I mean, that is a heavy, loaded title to carry around.
And you can tell from the transcript that Duk completely, vehemently rejects this framing.
To understand his defense, you really have to look at his background, right? He wasn't always a domestic political commentator sitting in a studio in Amsterdam.
No, he spent years as a foreign correspondent in Russia and in Germany.
Right. He returned to the Netherlands around, I think, 2014. And he claims that he simply brought back a set of reasonable, conservative analyses based on what he actually saw happening on the ground abroad.
What's fascinating here is the sheer disconnect between his self-perception and his public image. He returns to the Netherlands, looks at the geopolitical situation with Russia and Ukraine brewing at the time.
And he looks at the fallout from Angela Merkel's immigration policy in Germany, too, right? The whole, we can manage this thing.
Exactly. He starts offering critiques of the established centrist consensus in the Netherlands. But according to Duk, the response from the left-wing media and prominent columnists wasn't to debate the substance of his points.
No, of course not.
He claims they actively framed him as a radical right fascist or a Putin sympathizer. He argues that they created this malicious caricature of him so they just wouldn't have to engage with the actual mechanics of his arguments.
It's kind of like being invited to a dinner party to discuss the menu, but before you even arrive, someone has already convinced the entire room that you're planning to poison the food.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. Like, no matter what you say about the appetizers, everyone is just staring at your hands, waiting for you to pull out a vial of arsenic. You just can't have a normal conversation under those conditions.
But the interviewer actually pushes back on this victim narrative. And it's the really solid pushback.
Yeah, he doesn't let him off the hook.
Not at all. The interviewer points out that Duk is literally everywhere. He is a regular on one of the most popular, highly watched national television talk shows in the country.
Van Dog Inside, I think it's called.
Yeah. And he has a massive, highly successful podcast for De Telegraaf, which is the largest daily newspaper in the Netherlands.
So the interviewer essentially asks, like, wait a minute, how can you complain about being a canceled, silenced outcast when you literally have a national megaphone?
It is a totally valid counter-argument. And Duk's response reveals a lot about the mechanics of modern political debate and, well, how influence actually operates.
What does he say?
Duk acknowledges that he has a massive platform, sure, but he argues that he is treated as a systemic anomaly. He uses the phrase that he's treated like the weird uncle.
The weird uncle. Wow.
Yeah, he's allowed on television for entertainment value, to provide a bit of friction for the viewers, but he is never accepted as part of the legitimate intellectual consensus. He draws a really stark line between having an audience and having institutional legitimacy.
Oh, I see. So it's the difference between being a loud outsider and being a protected insider.
Yes, exactly. And Duk makes a stark comparison to illustrate this. He argues that true system insiders, even if they are highly controversial or hold like radical left-wing views, are ultimately protected by the establishment.
They get the benefit of the doubt.
Right. If they make a mistake, it's an honest error. But he and others on the conservative right face coordinated reputational destruction.
And he talks about how this constant hostile framing forces him to adopt a harder tone, right?
He calls it a gestreckt been, a straight leg, which is a reference to a hard, aggressive tackle in soccer. He admits his tone has become more populist, sharper. But he argues he had to do this just to survive the discourse.
So it's like a defense mechanism.
Exactly. If he doesn't speak in stark, hardline statements, he believes he will simply be intimidated, ground down, and pushed out of the public square entirely by the sheer volume of attacks.
Wow. Okay, so the most taboo subject at that table, the primary catalyst for Duk's controversial reputation, is undoubtedly his stance on migration.
Oh, without a doubt.
And this makes sense, right? Because the feeling of being silenced, of not being heard, almost always stems from trying to discuss the things society has deemed untouchable.
And Duk touches the third rail immediately in this interview. He makes a remarkably provocative statement. He states, flat out, all problems in this country start with migration.
Which is just an incredibly sweeping generalization. I mean, it makes you sit up straight in your chair.
Yeah, it does.
And the interviewer jumps on it instantly, as he should. He challenges Duk, asking him to clarify the mechanics of that statement. Like, do you just mean asylum seekers? Are you blaming refugees for literally everything?
And this is where Duk's argument takes a very interesting and much broader turn. He expands the definition of the problem significantly.
Right. He says it's not just about asylum seekers.
No, he says it's about a complete systemic lack of government policy on all fronts regarding population growth. He points to highly paid expats flooding the housing market in places like Amstelveen.
This is a crucial point because it shifts the focus from purely cultural grievances to, acute economic ones.
Duk is arguing that when massive international corporations bring in thousands of highly paid expats, it completely distorts the local housing market.
So local kids, the children of the Dutch middle and working classes, suddenly find themselves entirely priced out of the towns they grew up in.
Exactly. And he also points to foreign students.
Right. Yeah, the student issue is a major talking point for him. He argues that the massive influx of international students is causing the Anglicization of Dutch universities.
Meaning courses are increasingly taught in English rather than Dutch just to accommodate foreigners.
Right. And he claims this leads to a flattening of educational quality and, more practically, takes up limited spots in university cities like Eindhoven.
The mechanism he is pointing to is displacement. Local Dutch youth are being shut out of higher education and affordable housing in their own country.
And he says it's because the government has completely failed to implement quotas for temporary visas. He argues the population is swelling toward 20 million purely through immigration without any of the physical or social infrastructure required to support it.
But he doesn't stop at expats and students. He goes into much darker territory regarding asylum and lower-class migration.
Yeah, he starts making highly specific, alarming claims about integration. He talks about unintegratable youth from lower socioeconomic classes.
He specifically points the finger at Syrian and Moroccan youth, claiming they are actively terrorizing poorer neighborhoods.
And he adds a very heavy accusation regarding the mechanics of these communities. He claims that the parent communities of these youths often refuse to correct the bad behavior.
Right. Instead, when the kids are disciplined at school or arrested by the police, the parents simply blame Dutch racism for their problems, entirely avoiding internal accountability.
This is the absolute core of the friction in the interview. Dux is painting a picture of fundamental structural decay caused by parallel societies that just refuse to engage the host country's cultural norms.
But the interviewer pushes back hard here. He comes armed with a completely different perspective.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
The interviewer points out that if you look at the aggregate data, second- and third-generation immigrants are actually doing much better. The trend lines are positive.
They are integrating, their education levels are rising, and they are entering the workforce successfully.
The interviewer essentially accuses Duk of taking isolated incidents like specific problems with a group of Syrian youths or the high-profile crimes of the Moroccan mafia and treating them as structural norms.
Right, thereby unfairly smearing entire immigrant communities. And what we're actually watching here is a clash of epistemologies.
A clash over how we know what we know and what kind of evidence we trust.
Exactly. The interviewer is saying, look at the macro level data. The statistical reality shows a positive trend line over time. But Duk completely rejects that macro lens.
He insists that the newest generation is actually more radicalized and more Islamized than previous generations.
Yeah.
He completely dismisses the idea of linear statistical integration.
So how does he reconcile his broad brushstrokes with the interviewer's data?
Well, he grounds his dismissal not in counter statistics, but in deeply personal, traumatic, localized reality.
Oh, right, the anecdotes.
He shares a striking anecdote from the source material that explains his epistemology perfectly. Duk reveals that his own daughter's friends were physically present at two separate major terrorist attacks in Europe.
Wait, really? Two different attacks?
Yeah. One was a Palestinian-German classmate who was severely injured and whose teacher was killed when a jihadist drove a truck into a crowd in Nice, France.
That is incredibly heavy.
And another friend was present at the Christmas market attack in Berlin, where another truck was driven into the crowd.
Wow. I mean, that changes the entire context of his worldview.
Absolutely. For the progressive interviewer, migration and integration might be a sociological puzzle to solve with data points and economic policies and time.
But for Duk, it isn't abstract at all. It is a localized, visceral reality that he witnessed firsthand as a correspondent, and that directly impacted his family's inner circle.
He saw the physical fabric of Europe changing in violent ways. So when the interviewer points to employment statistics to say things are improving, Duk views that as a form of societal delusion.
A refusal to look at the blood on the street.
Exactly. To him, the statistics are just a mask covering a failing cultural reality.
Now, I'm struggling with the leap Duk makes next. I mean, I understand being deeply frustrated with the housing shortage caused by expats or being traumatized by local violence.
Right.
But how does he get from local migration issues to claiming that the entire architecture of democracy is broken? That feels like a massive categorical jump.
The bridge between those two ideas is the concept of unresponsiveness. If a citizen like Duk, or anyone else who shares his concerns, feels that their daily reality regarding neighborhood safety or housing shortages is being ignored.
Or actively denied by the politicians in charge.
Right. If it's denied, that distrust doesn't stay confined to just the issue of migration. It metastasizes.
Yeah.
If the system refuses to acknowledge the problem you see with your own eyes, you begin to assume the system itself is structurally compromised.
Which brings us to Duke's claim of institutional capture. He argues that the entire architecture of democracy, and by that he explicitly means the mainstream media, the judiciary, the ministries, the civil service, is completely jammed.
It is gridlocked. He asserts that these institutions no longer represent the average citizen, but instead represent a specific elite consensus.
A consensus that views the concerns of the average citizen with outright contempt, according to him.
And to prove this mechanism of institutional capture, he brings up a highly specific, very recent anecdote. He talks about the aftermath of the October 7th Hamas attacks on Israel.
Right, which brings us back to the scenario we opened the show with.
Exactly. Following those attacks, the Dutch government took a generally pro-Israel stance, aligning with traditional Western foreign policy. But Duk points out that civil servants working at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs were so angry about their own government's policy that they used their lunch breaks to protest.
Outside the ministry, protesting against the government they literally work for.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Duk is using this lunch break protest as evidence of a deeper structural shift. Think of the civil service as the operating system of a government.
Okay, I follow.
The traditional assumption was that higher education acts as a great equalizer. You go to university, you become a civil servant, you adopt a neutral institutional mindset, and you run the software of the state, regardless of which political party is in power.
But Duk argues that is a myth.
A total myth. He claims that when highly educated immigrants or people from different cultural backgrounds enter these institutions, they don't adapt to the old software. They install an entirely new operating system.
They bring their cultural paradigms and ideological biases with them into the halls of power.
He claims to have seen a leaked WhatsApp group of these civil servants where they were using Arabic phrases and showing profound solidarity with Palestine.
With absolutely zero regard for the democratically elected government's official line. So he is basically saying the bureaucracy is overriding the democracy.
And he mentions a chilling effect on the older civil servants, too. He argues that conservative civil servants, people who might favor stricter asylum policies or stronger pro-Israel stances, are forced to self-censor.
They see the protests outside the building, they see the partisan WhatsApp groups, and they keep their mouths shut out of fear of intimidation.
They realize they are entirely outnumbered by a progressive or parallel consensus within their own departments, so their programs just stop running.
But the interviewer, again, doesn't just let this slide. He pushes back on the fundamental premise of what those civil servants were doing.
The interviewer argues that Duk is misinterpreting their motivations. He points out that for these protesting officials, international law and human rights are at stake.
Right, they aren't trying to act as a subversive fifth column, as Duk suggests. They are acting out of a deep moral concern for humanitarian crises.
They believe the government is actively violating international norms, and they are exercising their democratic right to object to illegal actions.
This is a perfect distillation of the larger breakdown in communication. The interviewer sees civil servants bravely standing up for universal human rights against a flawed government policy.
While Duk sees a compromised, ideologically captured civil service actively undermining the democratically elected government from within.
They are looking at the exact same physical event, people standing outside a building on a lunch break, and they are experiencing two completely different realities.
And this profound distrust of institutional elites isn't just limited to debates over migration or the Middle East. If you believe the institutions are captured, that distrust immediately bleeds into how the government handles virtually every global crisis.
So if Duk believes the civil service and the experts are ideologically captured, you can totally see why he immediately rejects the interviewer's favorite solution for the next massive topic, climate change.
The interviewer champions the idea of a citizen assembly, specifically a burger ad for climate issues.
Now, for those who might not know, the mechanism behind a citizen assembly is something called sortition. It's essentially a lottery system.
Instead of relying on politicians who have to survive partisan primaries and pander to bases, you randomly select a representative group of normal citizens.
You put them in a room with experts, give them all the data, pay them for their time, and let them hash out a slow, deliberative consensus on climate policy. The interviewer loves this because it supposedly bypasses the screaming matches of modern politics.
But Duk dismisses it completely. He calls the Climate Citizen Assembly a hoax.
A hoax?
Yeah, and if you follow his logic from the previous section, you understand why. He argues that these assemblies are nothing more than political theater designed to legitimize elite policies that have already been decided behind closed doors.
Ah, so the mechanism he distrusts is the agenda setting.
Exactly. He believes the experts chosen to brief these random citizens will only present one side of the science, the alarmist side, meaning the outcome of the assembly is rigged from the very first presentation.
He argues that governments that constantly fail at basic tasks and institutions that are ideologically captured simply cannot be trusted to engineer a fair, unbiased process on something as economically complex as climate change.
And it's in this discussion about climate that the interviewer makes what I think is one of the absolute best observations of the entire deep dive.
Oh, the mirror moment.
Yes, Duk is complaining about how the youth are being brainwashed by climate alarmism. He specifically brings up Greta Thunberg.
He views her as an unqualified child who is treated as a saint, right? Elevated by politicians and the media to a status she fundamentally didn't earn.
But the interviewer stops him and holds up a mirror. He says, wait a minute, aren't you an alarmist?
It's such a good point.
You are sitting here constantly warning that society is going to hell, that we are going to the dogs because of migration and woke culture. You are literally doing the exact same thing she is doing, peddling fear and urgency just for a different audience.
Fantastic pushback. How does Duk defend this paradox?
Duk's defense is very revealing regarding how he views his own intellect versus the emotional appeals of his opponents. He essentially argues a difference in standing, agency, and historical grounding.
He claims that he is an adult with well-thought-out, historically informed analyses based on decades of real-world journalistic experience.
Whereas Thunberg, in his view, was a child who was exploited. He argues she was used as a human shield by a massive green industry and a left-wing cartel.
That saw an opportunity to make billions of dollars by leveraging her emotional appeal. Because, you can't easily criticize a passionate teenager without looking like a monster.
So he sees himself as a rational actor drawing logical conclusions from history, and he sees her as a manipulated symbol driving an economic agenda.
Furthermore, Duk describes himself as a conservative, but crucially, a conservative who believes in technological progress. He explicitly mentions Elon Musk.
Duk argues that destroying our current wealth, shutting down vital industries, and lowering the standard of living for the working class to combat what he considers an insignificant human impact on climate change is absurd.
The mechanism he trusts is human ingenuity. He believes that science like the Elon Musks of the world figuring out new technologies or going to Mars will eventually solve the environmental problems without requiring us to deliberately destroy our own economies today.
This critique of green energy policies doesn't exist in a vacuum for Duk. It seamlessly connects to his views on global power, specifically the war in Ukraine.
And this is where he exposes a really strange head-scratching paradox in modern politics. Let's look at the timeline Duk lays out.
According to him, Germany panicked over climate change. Driven by a desire to be green and spurred by the emotional fallout from the Fukushima disaster in Japan, Angela Merkel made the decision to shut down Germany's nuclear power plants.
Let's unpack the mechanics of that decision. When you shut down nuclear power, you're shutting down your baseload energy.
The heavy, consistent 247 power that runs massive factories.
Right. You cannot power the immense industrial engine of Germany, the machine building, the auto manufacturing in Bavaria, purely on wind and solar.
Because the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine, you need a reliable backup to fill the gaps in the grid.
So when Germany ideologically pivoted away from nuclear, they made themselves structurally reliant on cheap Russian gas to keep the lights on.
And then the war in Ukraine happens. The geopolitical landscape completely shatters.
The Russian gas gets cut off, or at least heavily sanctioned, and Germany's core industrial engine begins to collapse because their energy costs absolutely skyrocket.
And here is where Duk's analysis ventures into highly controversial geopolitical territory. He starts talking about the influence of neoconservatives and the mechanics of Western capital.
Duk argues that American neocons and big Western capital deliberately pursued an expansionist policy in Eastern Europe.
He claims they actively pulled Ukraine into the Western sphere of influence through foreign direct investment, political alliances, and military posturing, with the specific intent of provoking a confrontation with Russia.
Now, he explicitly states that this does not excuse Russia's invasion. He acknowledges that Putin pulled the trigger.
But he argues that the West knowingly played a dangerous, aggressive game of geopolitical chess that inevitably led to this disaster and the result of this proxy war. Europe is now entirely cut off from cheap Russian gas.
He even mentions that the Netherlands permanently capped its own massive gas reserves in Groningen with concrete, essentially taking their own energy independence off the table at the exact worst moment.
So Europe has to get its energy from somewhere to survive. And where is it coming from now?
It's coming in the form of incredibly expensive LNG, liquid natural gas, shipped in massive tankers across the ocean from the United States.
So what does this all mean? This is the paradox that Duke points out, and it's a wild one when you think about the historical alignments of political parties.
He points at left-wing politicians in Europe, the Green parties, the progressive blocs. Historically, these are the political factions that absolutely despise American big capital.
They protest endlessly against the fossil fuel industry, and they rally against American military imperialism.
Yet now, in the name of supporting Ukraine, fighting Russia, and transitioning away from domestic nuclear and fossil fuels, these exact same left-wing politicians are aggressively supporting policies that fundamentally enrich the American oil and gas industry and the American military-industrial complex.
It is a stunning reversal of historical positions. Duke is pointing out that the European left is effectively acting as the sales team for American LNG and defense contractors.
And what's remarkable in the source material is that the progressive interviewer actually agrees with Duke on this specific point.
He concedes that this is a fascinating, undeniable paradox of modern politics.
They actually find a moment of common ground in their mutual skepticism of big corporate power, even if they arrive there from completely opposite ideological starting points.
It's a rare moment of agreement, but it doesn't last long at all because they immediately have to turn to the question of how to actually fix the system.
If domestic politics are failing, if institutions are captured, and if our geopolitics are being dictated by foreign elites and energy crises, how do the citizens actually get their voices heard?
This brings us to the massive clash over democratic tools. Citizen assemblies versus binding referendums.
As we discussed earlier, the interviewer champions citizen assemblies. He believes that if you take a random lottery of citizens, put them in a structured environment with experts, and allow for slow, deliberative dialogue, you will find nuance.
The mechanism is designed to bypass the screaming matches of social media and find a sensible, educated middle ground.
But Duke wants absolutely none of it. He favors a Swiss-style, legally binding referendum, and the mechanics of the Swiss system are vital to understand here.
Right. Duke specifically cites a recent Swiss vote where the population voted to restrict immigration. For Duke, the beauty of the Swiss system isn't just that people get to vote, it's that the politicians are legally forced to execute the will of the people.
In a representative democracy like the Netherlands, which is built on multi-party coalitions and endless compromise, populist voices are naturally diluted.
But a binding referendum introduces a hard veto player. It forces the elite consensus to obey a direct order from the public, regardless of whether the politicians agree with it or not.
And Duke's preference for referendums is deeply rooted in recent Dutch political history, isn't it?
Yes, he points out that the Netherlands has experimented with referendums before, specifically an advisory referendum on the EU constitution, and later an advisory referendum on an association agreement with Ukraine.
In both cases, the Dutch public voted no. They explicitly rejected the proposals.
And in both cases, the government, specifically under the longtime Prime Minister Mark Rutte, essentially ignored the results, using parliamentary maneuvering to push the agreements through anyway because they were only advisory.
Duke argues that this specific mechanic, asking the people for their opinion and then aggressively ignoring it, is what creates massive systemic voter cynicism.
When the elite treat the voice of the people with indifference, or worse, view it as a threat to be managed and bypassed, the people realize the game is rigged.
Duke believes only a binding referendum with the threat of legal force behind it can make the political elite listen.
But advocating for these populist tools and maintaining a stance outside the protective bubble of the consensus comes with a severe psychological and physical cost.
The interviewer asks Duke a very poignant question about what the constant pushback, the media framing, and the hatred do to him personally. And Duke's response is a warning about what he calls the monster of the system.
This part is chilling. He warns that when you challenge the established order, the system activates against you like a biological immune response.
He points to other political figures to illustrate this mechanism of destruction. He mentions Thierry Baudet, a right-wing politician who Duke claims started out with serious intellectual arguments about democratic reform.
But who eventually devolves into sharing internet memes and wild conspiracy theories? Why? Duk implies it's because the pressure of being constantly attacked, sued, and excommunicated by the mainstream broke him psychologically.
He also points to Geert Wilders, who has had to live under 2,047 armed guard for 2 decades due to death threats, completely isolated from normal human society.
Duk's argument is that when the system completely excommunicates you, ruins your reputation, calls you a fascist on national television, and ignores the physical threats against your life, it inherently hardens you.
You have to put up massive emotional armor. He says you have to actively, consciously fight every single day not to become radicalized by the sheer volume of hatred you receive.
It's a tragic view of political life, that trying to fix the system almost inevitably destroys the person attempting to fix it.
And this tragic view extends beyond just the politicians on television. We move from the high-level political theories of assemblies and referendums down to the deeply personal, street-level reality of how citizens actually live together in this fractured system.
This brings us to Duk's ultimate conclusion about the state of his country.
He argues that the Netherlands, which he views as having once been the pinnacle of civilization, a high-functioning, high-trust democracy, has fundamentally lost its sense of community.
There is an old, very famous Dutch song about 15 million people on one piece of earth, a song celebrating a shared destiny despite differences.
The population is now 18 million, and Duk says no one feels that shared destiny anymore. He says the concept is dead, replaced entirely by the rise of parallel societies.
To illustrate this, Duk shares one final, incredibly vivid anecdote, and it perfectly encapsulates his entire worldview regarding epistemology and community.
He talks about his own son. Duk has a half-Turkish son who grew up in a gentrified neighborhood in Rotterdam, an area where different communities naturally mix.
His son has a good friend who is Moroccan Dutch. Duk explains that the parents all know each other, they get along perfectly well at the football club, they chat on the sidelines, everything is friendly and polite on the surface.
But then, October 7th happens, and the ideological fault lines crack wide open. Duk is at home, preparing to leave to attend a pro-Israel rally in Amsterdam.
The Moroccan father arrives at Duk's door to pick up his son for a play date, and the father is wearing a Free Palestine hoodie. He is on his way to attend a pro-Palestine rally.
This raises an important question, perhaps the most important question of the entire interview. Duk uses this story to show that while people can be polite, while they can chat about football or their kids, they are ultimately living in completely different ideological universes.
The interviewer tries to push back one last time. He argues that local community initiatives, neighborhood co-ops, and street-level interactions prove that social cohesion still exists, that people can bridge these gaps.
But Duk maintains that this is an illusion. He believes that without a shared, overarching consensus on fundamental values, without a shared narrative of what the country is and where it is going, true community is dead.
It has been replaced merely by people occupying the same geography, passing each other like ships in the night, until a crisis forces them to realize they have absolutely nothing in common.
It is a stark, deeply pessimistic view. It suggests that the social contract hasn't just been frayed by disagreements over policy, it has been fundamentally severed at the root.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today.
We really have. We've explored how a sense of being ignored leads directly to systemic polarization. We've seen how debates over migration and climate change are viewed by critics not as scientific or demographic necessities, but as elite impositions that ruin the lives of average people.
We unpacked the strange, head-spinning paradoxes of modern geopolitics, where left-wing Greens are enriching American military contractors.
And we looked at the fundamental clash over how to fix democracy, whether we need the slow, curated deliberation of citizen assemblies or the blunt veto force of binding referendums.
And the reason we map this out, the reason we dig so deeply into the mechanics of these arguments rather than just taking sides, is because understanding this clash is absolutely essential to navigating the modern world.
Why should you care about a Dutch interview between a progressive and a conservative? Because whether you find yourself agreeing with the interviewer's progressive optimism, his belief in aggregate data, in institutional reform, in the essential goodness of people coming together in assemblies,
or whether you align with Wierd Duk's conservative alarmism, his visceral reliance on lived experience, his distrust of captured elites, his demand for direct referendums.
You are living in the crossfire of this exact debate. Every single time you read the news, every time you cast a vote, or every time you try to talk to a neighbor who holds a completely different worldview, you are participating in this real-time, high-stakes stress test of democracy.
And that leaves us with a final thought to mull over. one that builds on everything we've discussed today. The entire concept of democracy, whether it relies on representative parliaments, citizen lotteries, or direct referendums, relies on one crucial underlying assumption.
It relies on the idea that despite all our intense differences, we all basically agree on the rules of the game, and we share some foundational vision for the future of our society.
But if Duke is right about the rise of parallel societies, if we reach a point where we no longer share those foundational values at all, where we are just disparate tribes occupying the same piece of earth, wearing opposing hoodies at the front door.
Is any democratic tool, no matter how cleverly designed, actually enough to hold us together? Or does democracy require more than just shared geography to survive?
That is the massive question we all have to figure out the answer to.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the consensus, keep looking past the labels, and we will catch you next time.